Hello, my name is Graham Brookie, and I am the director of the Digital Forensic Research Lab here at the Atlantic Council. It is my pleasure to welcome you, albeit virtually, to our conversation today entitled After the Insurrection, Countering Domestic Extremism in the U.S. Military and Law Enforcement. Today's event is hosted by the Atlantic Council's DFR Lab, the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, and the Georgetown Law's Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection. And this is the third in our series of conversations focusing on the nexus of disinformation, online radicalization, and domestic violent extremism. We're joined today by four distinguished experts and panelists who will be introduced shortly by my colleague, Jared Holt. Each of our guests will share their unique and authoritative perspective on the presence of extremist ideologies and sympathies within law enforcement agencies and the military. The January 6th assault on Congress was the direct result of a months-long effort rooted in disinformation that was promoted by then President Donald Trump and coordinated by some of his most fervent conspiratorial supporters along the spectrum of radicalization across the United States. Since then, dozens of individuals identified as current and former members of law enforcement and military have been arrested for participating in the insurrection that occurred on that day at the US Capitol. And several Capitol police officers have been suspended for their conduct during the insurrection. Now, in the wake of the attack, multiple questions regarding the scope of the current insider threat challenge posed by domestic violent extremist ideologies in the military and federal, state, and local agencies have come to the forefront of conversation. But it's also extremely important to note that this is a complex and nuanced issue. Law enforcement and military service members remain at the front lines to defend our democracy and protect the institutions of our government. So on January 6th, police officer Brian D. Sicknick was killed by violent insurrectionists, and two fellow members of the Capitol Police Force died by suicide following the event. The institutions of military, federal government, as well as state and local partners must now adjust and strengthen and coordinate programs to safeguard against insider threat challenges and bolster efforts to counter violent domestic extremism. So for instance, in the background checks for federal positions dealing with national security, which a number of the panelists are familiar with, one of the questions is number 29.3. Have you ever advocated any acts of terrorism or activities designed to overthrow the US government by force? And it's safe to say that in previous years, that question has not been as much the focus of that questionnaire as it now is. So in today's conversation, after defining the current challenge, this conversation will then focus and turn to action of what can and should be done. With that, I'd like to thank our panelists for taking the time out of their busy schedules to join for this conversation. And I want to thank you all for taking the time out of your day to join us for this discussion. If you'd like to engage with our speakers and ask them questions, please use the Q&A chat in the Zoom window or on social media. And I'll now pass to DFR Lab's resident fellow dealing with domestic violent extremism, Jared Holt, who will moderate today's conversation.
Thanks for that introduction, Graham. I'm joined today by three other absolute all-star experts on this topic and where it intersects with law enforcement and military. We're joined today by Paul Goldenberg. He's the chairman and president of Cardinal Point Strategies and a senior fellow at the Miller Center at Rutgers University. We're also joined by General Russell L. Honore, who's a retired lieutenant general in the United States Army, and Mary McCord, who is the former professor, and Tom Warwick of the Atlantic Council, and Mary McCord of Georgetown's ICAP. So thank you all for joining me today. And I think the first thing that would be helpful for us to do in general, I'll pass it to you for this first, is to kind of define exactly what we're talking about. Domestic extremism and its intersection with law enforcement and the military is certainly nothing particularly new, but it has come under increased scrutiny and increased focus and urgency since the attack on the Capitol. And one of the questions I've seen floating around out there in the universe is the degree of overlap between domestic extremism and the ways that falsehoods about the election spread, at some points by President Donald Trump, then President Donald Trump, how that interacts and what the scope should be for any sort of approach to countering this within law enforcement and military.
Well, that's a tough opening question, Jared. You and Graham set us up here for success or failure with your eloquent opening and a great question. I think when we all share our own experience and we'll all will look at this from different lens of what we hope culminated on 1/6, but it did not culminate there. There's still the rest of the story to be told. I think in retrospect, we will look at the American public being woke, if I may use that contemporary word of you young folks, to the level of extremism that people were willing to take action on. It's not that it hadn't been present in our society. It's a different thing when people take actions as a result of their beliefs. And the event has been tagged as an insurrection. Now, that's looking at it in a rearview mirror and how we're going to look at it going forward to figure out how we get to control this in our democracy. When I look at this from my days in the Pentagon working on the Joint Staff, and we were starting a information operations cell, we went over and briefed Senator Warner. And he said, okay, now tell me again what this information operation is. I said, how we take a sliver of the truth, put it out to people who want to believe it, and let them run with it. So some semblance of the truth, tell it to people, and let them take actions. And this was a tool that we have available in military and in diplomatic corps to influence operations in other countries. We explained that to him clearly. You know what he said to us? I don't want that headquarters in the Pentagon. Y'all can have it, but you got to move it to another state. Because if this instrument get loose inside of our political system, it will have a great danger to our economy, to our democracy. And this idea of being woke, what we see information operations, putting out something that has a sliver of truth to people who want to believe it. And I say that again. That's right on the verge of what we saw in the last generation called propaganda, where you take a message, you repeat it, you repeat it, you repeat it. It's like the guy who keep lying about having a horse. You keep telling people they have a horse and somebody gonna give them a saddle. And people who wanting to believe that message, that the election was stolen, they rode with it. And they continue to ride with it. And that is the instrument of propaganda, another messaging system used repetitively by people in power to shape what people think. Now, worst case, what people are willing to act on. And I think like a magnet, you throw on the table with small boats, you put that magnet down, people draw to it. And the big draw is people with military experience and our veterans and our police officers. Because when they go out and they tell somebody, well, I'm a police, people tell, well, thank you for your service. Thanks for protecting our community. Thanks for protecting our country. And the same thing with veterans. You know, you go to events now and, well, all the veterans stand up and everybody clap. Thanks for protecting our. So we draw from the military and the police a certain degree of respect in the community, because we were prepared to defend and support the Constitution of the United States against all enemy, foreign and domestic. And that comes with a lot of gravitas to say we have invested more and we have a bigger say on whether and how, what's right and what's wrong. Well, we don't. We're just citizens like everybody else that served our country in uniform, in military or in the police. That's my take on it, but I think we've been had by a little propaganda and a superb use of information operation, which is an offensive weapon, to shape people's minds. And again, just tell them a little BS about what they want to hear, a sliver of truth, and have them act on it. Now I'm going to pass this over to the esteemed colleague of mine, Mary McCord, the professor and lawyer, to clean up what I just said. Thank you.
I don't really think I could say it any better, General, but to put a little bit of a frame on it, because I spent almost 25 years at the Department of Justice, many of those years working counterterrorism, we see disinformation such as the stop the steal propaganda. Oftentimes disinformation is the justification used by extremists who will then act on that. As you indicated, the question is not what do you believe, the question is how do you act on it? And extremists who will act on that and act on it violently, that becomes the threat to our public safety and our national security here in the US. And of course, as also can be a threat abroad. So in this last year, we saw disinformation about the pandemic. We saw disinformation about racial justice demonstrations over the summer, and disinformation about the election, both before the election and after the election. And all of this disinformation was used by extremists who propagated it online. They propagandized, they recruited, they monetized, and this culminated in January 6th, but that was just one of many different times over this past year that we saw extremists come forth interacting with the public, sometimes in the form of unlawful private militias, heavily armed, engaging with the public, sometimes storming state houses before the storming of the US Capitol on January 6th. So the belief itself is not alone enough to make a person to an extremist. But as you said, that sliver of truth with a whole bunch of BS around it can become the, when propagandized, can become the supposed justification for extremist activity. And we've certainly seen that here in the US.
Tom, Paul, do either of you have anything to add? Otherwise, we've got our lane and let's go down it. All right, so trying to say something?
Hear me now? Yeah.
There you go.
Interestingly enough, DARPA was way ahead of the game. I barely, by my own admission, and my grown children will laugh at me, and as well as my grandchildren, that I barely knew how to navigate the internet 12, 13 years ago, albeit a computer. But DARPA put out there the power of the meme. And they basically said that the meme could be something that could very easily be weaponized. And this was over a decade ago. And unfortunately, that report probably sat in a dust pile somewhere, either, no offense to the Pentagon, either in the Pentagon or an intelligence service. And it was pretty much spot on. But I heard Mary speak about how the extremists are really leveraging and weaponizing tools for the purposes of disinformation. You know what, though? So are opportunists. And the opportunists, although they may not meet the scale of an extremist, they too are very much mixing the pot. And we've been in an unprecedented time. Never in American history. It's been the perfect storm. Never in history. We have hundreds of millions of people in front of their computers, on their laptops, on their mobile phones, and extremely, extremely confused and baffled as to what the truth is. And then unfortunately, and I'll wind it down by saying we at the same time that we need to be concerned about the domestics that are influencing us, we have some very bad players that are sitting in other parts of the world that are using this as an opportunity to really fire up masses as well. So we probably just didn't listen to those that were reading the grape leaves at the right time in the right place.
And then Jared, if I can jump in, one of the things I think that ties in what the General and Mary and Paul have just said is the idea that we have to start with the proposition that truth means something. And while there can be multiple truths depending on people's perspective, not all truths or not all perspectives are entitled to equal validity or respect. An insider threat often turns on what range of truths are acceptable among members of a law enforcement or security community. And so the starting point is that while members of law enforcement or security organizations don't give up their First Amendment rights when they swear an oath to protect and serve the public, behavior that would give rise to a minor concern, if we're talking about a member of the general public, can give rise to a very serious concern when we're talking about somebody who is entrusted to know and enforce the laws fairly and justly. And this is why the insider threat from white supremacists and anti-government groups is such a major concern today.
Thanks for that, all. So the next place let's go is that insider threats, extremist ideologies, and even groups in their overlap with law enforcement and the military aren't really new. For example, there was a 2019 project that was published in Reveal that reported finding hundreds of police officers within Facebook groups that had extremist and hateful ideologies. Every year, a prominent anti-immigrant hate group considered by the SPLC invites dozens, if not hundreds, of sheriffs to DC for lobbying. So the overlaps with these ideologies within members of law enforcement and the military has been around for a while. But so I guess one of the questions we should try to tackle here is why this threat maybe hasn't been tackled as urgently earlier, and how, as we go forward, we can reconcile with whatever inaction may have been occurring in the past. Mary, I'd love to pass this one to you.
Sure. Well, I definitely want to hear from the others who've been in the military and the police force, but I will say that, looking with, we entrust a lot of the defense of our democracy to these very people, right? To our military, to our police officers, just as General Honoré was saying and Paul was saying. And these are groups that are sworn to support and defend the Constitution. And sometimes they don't like looking inward very much. And so there hasn't been the same type of incentive always, I think, to root out extremism from within these branches when there are people harboring those views within them themselves. But one thing I do want to make sure we talk about before we get to maybe some of the more practical pieces of this is that oftentimes I think that there is a little bit of an overblown narrative about First Amendment protections that suggests that it is not okay for the military to try to root out extremism, or not okay for police agencies to try, or police departments to try to root out extremism, that by doing so they would be infringing on members of the military's First Amendment rights or police officers' First Amendment rights. And to be clear, within the military in particular, there are certain infringements on First Amendment rights that are permissible because it is such an important mission. And of course, the general can speak more to this. The mission of protecting and defending the U.S. from all enemies, foreign and domestic, requires there to be unity of effort, unity of command, and not having those who would not be able to work together toward the common mission. Even within police departments and any kind of government employees, First Amendment rights are not absolute. So while it is true that people speaking in their personal capacity, not their official capacity, so let's take a police officer speaking in his personal capacity on his personal Facebook, he has a right to speak about issues of public concern, but his employer, the police department, can restrict that right so long as it is tied to the role of policing and important for the role of policing. So just to be concrete about that, if a police officer is using his personal Facebook or personal social media to spout anti-Semitic rhetoric, racist, white supremacist rhetoric, anti-immigrant rhetoric, the kind of things that are oftentimes the fodder of extremists, that actually has a direct impact on the ability of his police force to build trust with the communities that they serve, to protect public safety by being able to rely on community members, to pass tips along to them, to feel safe and comfortable reporting crime to those police. So it has a direct impact on the ability of the police to do their job. And that is something where police officers do not have free rein to say anything they want in their personal capacity. That can be restricted. And so I say this in answer to your question because I think sometimes the reason this stuff is not rooted out is because of using that First Amendment as a shield. Well, we can't get involved in that or we'll get in trouble. And there is more leeway there. Not that I want people's rights to be infringed, but there's more leeway there when it comes to extremist propaganda than I think some people believe there is.
So the presence of insider threats definitely undermines the work of law enforcement and military. And sometimes it can even pose a threat to law enforcement and military themselves. Paul, if you could speak a little bit to how insider threats can jeopardize law enforcement, I'll then go to the general who might be able to explain how and if that differs with the military.
Look, the old cliche, building communities of trust, you have to have communities of trust between the federal authorities and the local authorities, the state authorities. And if there is no community of trust, you're not going to get any information, as Mary so eloquently stated. You're not going to get information from the communities themselves, which is where things all began. I will say, though, I've spent 3.5 decades in law enforcement. I wore a uniform. I walked the beat, pushed a police car, and wound up at a senior position at the Attorney General's office as the head of hate crimes for Jersey. And the reason I'm mentioning that particularly is that I've seen a lot of hate crimes in my time committed against vulnerable and all communities. I will tell you, it's really about awareness and dedication. Once the police officers and the detectives and others were provided awareness training and education, and they better understood the impact of a hate crime, not only on their community, but the impact on their own lives, I saw a transitional change. This was over a period of 3 decades. There was great commitment, and I still see that today. I just finished crossing the country with General John Allen, and I headed up the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's faith-based initiative that studied attacks on various religious institutions across the country. And I will tell you, the good news here is, which sometimes people don't want to hear, that everywhere we went, whether it was a Sikh temple or a Jewish synagogue or a church or an AME, we have come a long way. The relationships between the local police as it relates to the investigation and sensitivity and awareness of hate crimes and the communities has come an extraordinary way. Now, I'm not making excuses. We have 800,000 police officers. There is no doubt we're going to have a number that will hold potentially extremist views and views that are contrary to who they are, what they are, and literally what they represent. And that's something that I agree with Mary. We have not been real good at as far as looking inside our own houses. But for the most part, there has been a positive transition. We have a lot more to go. So inside threat, is it an inside threat? Absolutely. It's not only an inside threat as to the integrity and the respect that the communities themselves will have on our police, but it's also, in retrospect, I can't get the vision out of my head of someone that allegedly was a sworn police officer that was swinging an American flag at a Capitol police officer. That does not compute for me. And something has gone awry, and we really need to do some deep soul searching in that regard.
Now, General, I'm interested in your take on the kind of threats and undermining that insider threats can do to the military?
Well, I can see, we see what happens when there's an incident, whether it's a mass shooting or 1/6. The first thing is a veteran. We get identified when incidents happen, first as a veteran. When I say we, the perpetrator, people who commit bad acts, the amplification of the fact that this person learned how to shoot in the military, or they were discharged from the military, or their military experience probably gave them ability to cause more harm. Our problem in the military is it's hard for us to, in many cases, to identify extremism because we hadn't been trained on it. I can remember when I took my first company command in Korea in 1972, one of the big problems we had was marijuana. Well, I left a base out in California, which was in the desert. And to be honest with you, in 1971, I couldn't tell you marijuana from a bloodweed. I didn't know what it was. And we hadn't been trained on it. We'd see a picture of a marijuana leaf on a t-shirt out in California. That was about it. So I get to Korea, springtime come, and next to my headquarters, the grass just popped up all over the place. And the first sergeant would tell some troop to go out and clean up the grass. And one day we had a young lieutenant come in from West Point. He said, you know, there's marijuana growing all around the company area. I said, what the hell are you talking about? He said, come here, let me show you. He said, that's marijuana. I was walking on it every day and didn't know what the hell it was. And we had this hill behind my company area called Happy Hill. And I wonder why the troops would go out there in the evening and I would hear them laughing. They had big old marijuana plants up there. We did not recognize what it was when we were looking at it. It was in plain sight. I remember when we went through issues in the Army with gangs. People that joined the Army. And again, we missed the signals. We did not recognize the tattoos. And finally, the CID and others came around and trained us on what tattoos to look for because they were in plain sight right there on people's arms that committed themselves to an extremist view and a commitment to a gang that they were willing to, in many cases, die for. We didn't recognize it. And I think the challenge we see today in the military, you know, we go through about 400-some-thousand applications a year to try to get a little over 200,000 recruits a year, is that we've gotten a little more sophisticated at asking certain questions, looking for tattoos. Tattoos are a big indicator. And then when we got troops in the regular Army, finally, last year, the Confederate flag was banned on military installation. I grew up in the Army where I'd see fellow soldiers drive up with a Confederate flag on the front of their truck. And, you know, somebody would kid them about it. Hey, man, I'm from Alabama. That is my heritage. And they were good old guys. You never saw anything. I mean, go out and drink, get cold together, take care of one another. And it wasn't a symbol of extremism. And people kind of just went along with it. But in recent years, as I said, and the Marines and the Army have subsequently taken action. Hey, you can't have that Confederate flag in your room over your bunk. That is offensive as hell to some young person or that's joined the Army that might be from the South who know what it is and what they've been grown up. Their grandparents told them what that flag represent and great grandparents. But many a time we miss the signals. We're so busy looking for the enemy that might be flying a supersonic airplane or has a secret missile or some foreign extremist. We have not paid enough attention to the signs and signals and indications and warning among our rank. But what data shows us now, 5 years ago, 22% of military people, according to a recent poll that was done in Military Time, 22% of them had witnessed some type of extremism. The recent last poll that was taken, 35% have witnessed some type of extremism among the members in their unit. So it's there, it's relevant. It's how we get the senior leadership to recognize it, to look for it, recognize it, and act on it. It's hard to get somebody to go after somebody based on their ideas or their beliefs. It's when they display it on their arm, or they put it on their truck, or it's in their wall locker, is primarily. I've never seen a formation where there's a problem with somebody walk out in front of me and say, I don't like all of you people. I don't like all of you people. Never saw that happen. It doesn't happen that way. It often get exhibited when somebody's had too much to drink, or they get in a fight, is when those beliefs can come out. And what we saw on 1/6 was people acting, many of them veterans. A fifth of them were former military. And I don't use the word veterans because people behold after 20 years in the military. No, about 7% of our population have served in the military. And I'm not quite sure how much we prepared them for something like the event on the 6th. I think it might give them more confidence to go do stupid things, but we don't really train people to be a super fighter in a riot. I mean, that's not a tactic we use, because most of the stuff they were doing would violate the Geneva Convention if they would have taken forward those warriors who perceived themselves saving the nation by attacking the Capitol, and the techniques they use. That being said, it's in our eyes. We've got to get educated on it. We got to educate parents. But look, we got to get beyond the uniformed police and the uniformed soldiers. We got to get on these college campuses. There's a hell of a lot more people out there than uniformed people who are active in this game. And we need to indoctrinate students when they come to college what to look for, because it's not hard for somebody to take a belief. There's an old saying, watch what you read, because that's what you start to think. Watch what you think, because you will act on it. And that's a loose translation of Maya Angelou, closest I'll come to repeating any of her prose. But we really got to watch what we read and watch what we think, because it can become what we act when that's fed by propaganda, repeating the lie, and or whatever that message might be, with a sliver of the truth that get people to act. And that's my take on it. I'm sorry for the long answer, but when you're fighting for words, it's harder. You got to take longer. I'm sorry about that, Jared.
Oh, totally fine. Tom, this one's for you. So we've gravitated in a lot of these conversations towards language around insider threats. And a lot of the reason for that is because there's existing policy frameworks for insider threats, especially in counterintelligence. But is it the right place to start? Are there any pitfalls or nuances here that people should be aware of if we're going to take that kind of approach to insider threats in law enforcement and military?
So, as the general said, and as your question implies, every military, every national agency or department, including justice, homeland security, and defense, has a very active insider threat program. So, in fact, do most state and local law enforcement agencies. The challenges are twofold. The first is what the general just described so eloquently. It's recognizing white supremacism and anti-government behavior as the threat that it actually is. And too often, perhaps there was a blind eye in some places to this kind of threat and the danger that it poses for constitutional governance and indeed for American democracy. So one of the challenges is going to be adapting what amounts to the curriculum of how we teach young people, starting even, I would go further back than the general does and start in high schools with a robust program of civic education so that people get a better understanding of their responsibilities as a citizen in a democracy. And then when we get to more advanced training, one of the questioners I noticed posed the fact that death by PowerPoint has taken over programs to highlight attention on de-radicalization. That suggests we may need to find better ways of making sure people really do recognize and understand the challenges they face, and indeed in many cases the challenge that people may hold in their own hearts if they were not brought up with the right kind of parenting and background. Where this gets us to, though, is that we're going to clearly have an easier time of it in centralized organizations where there is a chain of command and there is a hierarchy of discipline. It's easier to see a more effective program in a place like the Department of Defense or the Department of Justice or DHS. The real challenge, I think, is going to be taking this to the state and local level, where it's not possible for a single voice to lay down an objective and a commanding vision to be able to change the hearts and minds and behaviors that need to be changed. We do need to recognize that systemic racism and a streak of anti-government attitudes is widespread in the United States. And we need to also recognize that belief is one thing, action is another. But in particular, when you're talking about the people who have sworn an oath to protect the community, as Mary said, the standard has to be a little bit different. And we have to have higher expectations for our law enforcement and our military and our security officials, because so much of what they do is never going to be viewed on videotape. It's going to be out of public eye and memory, and we need to be able to trust and have confidence that the decisions that these officials will make in their official behavior is consistent with the values that Americans hold and aspire to. And so that's going to take a lot more effort and challenge and dedication than it's going to take to solve some of these problems at the national level. So I think really the state and local level is where we're going to find this battle against insider threats to go on. And that's really where it is going to be the hardest to try to win it.
Paul, do you have any insights on to how that challenge can be met at the state and local level, as Tom just described?
Yeah, I agree with everything Tom said, because I just wrote down on a piece of paper civics. I just wrote it down. You know, the basic educating folks in what is the Constitution? How did we get to this place? Why is it so precious? And Mary and I had a conversation earlier today when we were offline, really about so few really understand or realize that, particularly those that may be influenced, that the first thing that some of the extremist groups want to do is do away with the police. The police are as much a target, if not more so, than any vulnerable or minority group, and sometimes they don't understand that. You know, these groups are seditionists. They want to see the entire takedown of our Constitution and who we are as a people, and that's why I go right back again, even to the veterans. So maybe we're not doing a good enough job in you know, with the awareness, education, and training, which will absolutely target harden a community. So everything does start locally. It's all about the culture within the department, or it's all about the culture within the community. And I think that starts with training. And Tom, you hit it straight on. People have to understand what this all really means to them if they are in these sworn positions. Some, you know, we lose when they go through police academies or basic training, things get lost along the way, and sometimes the culture of a department may replace whatever they learned. And that goes back to leadership, and it goes back to leadership training, training police executives, training frontline supervisors. Some of the most important positions in policing are the sergeants. God love them. They really are. Sometimes things begin and end with the sergeants. How much training do we provide to that level that as it relates to civics and understanding who and what we are as a nation?
And Mary, I'm going to send a question your way, and then we're going to go through the chat and try to pull out a few Q&A questions. All I see is a couple dozen notifications down there, so apologies in advance. We're just not going to have time to get to all of them, but we'll try to get to as many as we can. So, there's the civics component that we've been talking about, but the fact is that law enforcement and the military are both very appealing vectors for extremist groups to appeal to. People in the military and law enforcement are trained in using force. If they're active, they can be authorized to use force while performing duties. It's already a very networked system. So by reaching out to one police officer, for example, that police officer can go talk to other police officers, and it becomes kind of a productive recruitment vector, specifically for militia level groups. And I'm curious what kind of tools and strategies are available that we can use that aren't running afoul of those boundary lines of the First Amendment that you talked about at the beginning of the program.
Yeah, it's a great question, Jared. As you know, that some private militias in particular deliberately recruit from law enforcement and the military because of the training, because of their skills in firearms, incendiary devices, and other paramilitary tactics and techniques. And in fact, coming out of the insurrection, still the largest conspiracy that has been charged so far is against a group of Oath Keepers, where I think we're up over a dozen now, or at a dozen at least. And that is a group that specifically targets law enforcement and military for its members for all of those reasons. But other groups do so as well. And so, part of the issue we've been talking about with this insider threat is what can these organizations, military and law enforcement, do to try to prevent, extremism within their ranks, or then take action when they do find it. And, we already talked a little bit about the First Amendment, but for some policy things, Tom raised the point about this might be easier at the federal level, FBI level, military, as Secretary of Defense Austin has now taken, action with his stand down order, than it is at the state and local level. But there are policies that can affect state and local. State and local law enforcement rely heavily on federal government financial support for their policing operations. They rely on it for equipment. They rely on all kinds of different grants administered by the federal government. And there's no reason that those types of things can't be incentivized by policies and programs that are designed by the state and locals to actually address the problem of extremism in their ranks. Money talks, and these are state and local law enforcement that need that kind of financial and equipment support from the federal government. So one thing that I think that the federal government ought to be thinking about doing is incentivizing, proactive actions to ferret out extremism through tying these things to financial incentives. The other thing I would note is that, and just very briefly, because I can go on and on about this, is that the Second Amendment doesn't protect the type of unlawful private militia activity that we have seen on January 6th and throughout really decades in this country, but certainly more and more over the past year. Many unlawful private militias will say that, they are a well-regulated militia, but well-regulated within the Constitution, and dating back historically, even before the founding, meant regulated by the government. The individual right to bear arms for self-defense, the Supreme Court has said, is that it does not protect private paramilitary organizations, which must be able to be prevented in order to protect public safety, health, peace, and good order. The Supreme Court said that as long ago as 1866, upholding an anti-militia statute that exists on the books of 29 states to this day. Anti-paramilitary activity statutes are on 25 different states' books and the federal code. So you cannot engage in paramilitary training, that's use of firearms, bombs, or just tactics capable of causing bodily injury or death, intending to use those in a civil disorder. And a lot of those groups that came on January 6th had been training. We've seen it in the charging documents, training in paramilitary activity so that they could undertake that insurrection. So there needs to be crackdowns, by police looking within. The tools exist. There are laws that exist on the books. They've been upheld in terms of their constitutionality, but they've been largely ignored in many respects because the very people responsible for enforcing those tools are the people who might have a problem.
Thanks for that, Mary. Let's go to some Q&A. General, I'll send this one to you. So the DoD materials, this comes from Christina, the DoD materials that were sent as part of the extremism stand down didn't mention January 6th or disinformation about the election. We talked earlier about death by PowerPoint, right? I think was the term. What can senior leaders do in the military to ensure that we're having candid conversations about this while avoiding appearing overly partisan about it?
Well, I think the uniformed services, we do things best when we describe what we want the soldier to do, soldier, sailor, airman, marine, or coast guardman. When we give them the task, the condition, and the standard. I don't think we've done that. We've given them the outcome we want, which is to expunge and control extremism, but we may not have designated, like the example I gave you about how do you recognize the bad tattoos? How do you recognize marijuana growing out the damn sidewalk next to your building? We have to go beyond identifying tattoos. We have to have our agencies that monitor internet, because there's still people that actually use their real name on Facebook and put up hate talk. It's hard to trace them, but some of them use their real name. So I think screening people as they go from one next to the level, do social media screening, as we are doing security clearance checks to make sure people don't grow up and get more responsibility over other people if they have extremist ideas, and if they've expressed them, number one, because if they've expressed them, that's enough. You don't need to wait for them to act. You need to take action. But I don't think we've got it as clear as we think. I was trying to find how many court martials we had last year for extremism. I couldn't find any. Now you can find how many people were court-martialed because of sexual assault. I mean, it's another topic we wrestle with over and over again. We know it's a big problem in the military. We struggle with it because most of the formation is not doing it. It's that small percentage that act on their thoughts. And we continue to struggle with both sexual assault and with extremism. But again, the extremism is hard to identify and hard to act on. And we need to do better training. We need to identify the standards. We need to respect people First Amendment right. We must respect people's right to think about what they want to think. I mean, my God, we put a uniform on you, we bar you for 2 years or 20 years, or in my case, 37, you're still an American citizen. We can't expunge what people think. The problem is when they act. We had it for a long time in the military. You grew up watching movies that taught some of you the nasty words you call people. You remember what we called people in World War II, right? I won't say the word. What did we call them in World War II on both the Atlantic and the Pacific side? Had some pretty nasty name. If you walk in the bar today and call somebody that, you get the hell punched out of you. But we use those words. Look what we called people we were fighting with in Vietnam. Why? Because throughout history, the military has vilified our enemies. it was a technique that was kind of used inadvertently, that if you're going to shoot this person, they're your enemy. And we vilified them, and we came up with these names. Again, today, if you were to go out and scratch it on the sidewalk or put it on the side of your car, people would stop and say, what the hell are you doing? Why are you using this extremist word? And how many times have you watched John Wayne movie when he used one of those words? Again, today it wouldn't be socially acceptable, but you might get your sergeant asking you some questions about if you are prejudiced or do you have some extreme thoughts. But we taught soldiers that. I mean, it wasn't in formal instruction. It was in the language of the craft that we vilified our enemies. And people have written about that since World War II. It's been captured in books and movies. And you see it today, you watch an old black and white movie and say, wow, they did speak back then? Yes, they did. We vilified our enemies. And now, how do we use today's technology and information to identify when people have some extreme idea, but they might act on it? And that's the challenge we have, Jared. That's the best, close I can come to what I see, what I hear, and what I read about. Thank you.
That's a really great point, General. And it leads to this question here from Michael that I found in the chat. Paul, I'll give you a shot at this one. Extremists have within their minds a very strong them and us. Like a lot of extremist propaganda works on othering things. It is, whether it is a minority group, whether it is a source of authority, it is, the whole point is to other it and then attack it. And, this kind of language, detecting the enemy, that sort of thing, it's very commonplace in sort of the jargon that we use, frankly, to talk about military or law enforcement action. It's neutralizing. It's, these words that have that othering effect that you were talking about, General, where you're taught the person you're enforcing whatever it is against is the enemy somehow. And this question from Michael kind of gets at, it is even just that kind of language or that kind of enemy's mindset that's being cultivated there. Do you think, as we try to tackle insider threats or domestic extremism in the ranks, it's worth potentially re-examining that? I think you're muted, Paul.
Yep. It's so much easier to attack someone that's been dehumanized. And even decades ago, that's something that is a learned behavior. You dehumanize folks, and it's much easier to go at them. Well, the internet, social media has accelerated that. It's now on steroids. People attack each other without ever having to look in each other's eyes. And I go back to the old cliche, sticks and stones. Well, there's a lot of terrified people out there, some of which who have taken their own lives, some of which who don't come out at night, some of which their lives have been completely overturned because of dehumanization. And look, historically, we know, as the general said, names were used upon our enemies. It hasn't changed much. What has changed is this little thing called the internet, which is the best of both worlds, right? It's the greatest place in the world, and has become a very, very lethal place. I go back to Mary because, coming from the Attorney General's office, we worked a case where it was names. Most of you on this line probably never heard of Whitefish, Montana, other than it's one of the most beautiful, pristine places in America. It's a community of 8,000. There's a small Jewish community there of 130, many of which actually born and raised in Montana. And this community, which is a part of the greater community, 3.5 years ago, was terrified, was beaten down almost to the point where they were going to leave the Daily Stormer and a white supremacist website decided that they were going to focus on this group in Whitefish, and they took the faces of the children, Jewish children, and put the Jude Star of David on them. They knew exactly how far they could go to the line. Where was the line? And the reason I'm bringing this particular case up, here we are, 2018, modern America, a most prestige, beautiful place, and people were considering running for what they believed were their lives, because of words. So we do have a long way to go. We have to determine and work with the Attorney General's office and justice to determine where is that line in America today. And where does one cloak him or herself behind First Amendment to terrorize an individual or an entire community? So the dehumanization process has absolutely been accelerated. What makes it tougher, and I'll close with this, what makes it tougher is the law enforcement communities, they're overwhelmed right now, internally, externally, a lot going on. So they have not been able to keep up. The state and local agencies have not been able to keep up with these types of crimes. What does it mean? Where and when can we investigate? And if we pick up the phone and call the FBI, what are they going to do with this? So we really do have to take a look at this as a process. One thing that I think we didn't mention with a process in the military or in the police is reporting. We need to really establish a reporting mechanism that is trusted, that is a trusted mechanism. I mentioned Crime Stoppers, one of the most popular systems that solve more crimes than probably the world's detectives, and it's done because it's an external mechanism that's trusted and has no agenda. And I'm not promoting them for any other reason. That we need a reporting mechanism that is a trusted mechanism and people will rely on. Thank you.
All right, we're running up on time here. So, Tom, solve this for us. What should we do about this?
Well, let me put out 3 points on which I think many of us would agree. The first, to build on Paul's point that he just made, we're actually talking about a problem whose numbers are, in absolute terms, rather small. The number of people who really pose an insider threat in law enforcement, in our military, is small in number, but their effect is corrosive on public confidence in law enforcement, our security organizations, and the people who are sworn to protect the Constitution and the people. So we need to bear in mind we're talking about trying to deal with a very small but very corrosive threat. Second, as several people have pointed out, most particularly and effectively the general, we're talking about a problem that needs leadership. We need the leaders of our country to stand up and say and do the right things about calling attention to the extent and nature of the problem and the need for what really is acceptable behavior. Every organization I've ever been a part of or known, whether it's been federal government, local law enforcement, the military, runs on the backs of the sergeants, of the frontline leadership to whom everyone looks to when they start out in their careers. And modeling behavior there is absolutely vital to dealing with this issue. At the third point is that we need to recognize this is going to take resources in order to address effectively. Many of us were extremely pleased when we saw the Department of Homeland Security announce on February 25th that they were going to require state and local governments to devote at least $77 million of a much larger grant program to fighting the threats from domestic terrorism. But let's be honest, as we've been talking about here today, it's apparent that $77 million is the proverbial drop in the bucket. This is going to take a much more serious and sustained effort. It's going to take support from appropriators in the Congress, in state legislatures, and even on city and town councils to realize that it is important to devote resources to this issue, to the kind of training, to the kind of collection of basic information that's essential if we're going to address this threat. I'm confident, based on my understanding of American history, as the general so rightly pointed out, we have faced problems like domestic terrorism before, and we have overcome them. These things do tend to come in waves. My colleague Javed Ali calls this now the fifth wave of this kind of some kind of domestic terrorism. But it does show that this can be overcome. And I think what we're going to need to do is to commit both the leadership and the resources in order to addressing this effect in an effective, this threat in an effective way. And I think the United States is able to take on this kind of a challenge. So Jared, back to you.
Well, that's a great point to end it on. Tom, Mary, Paul, General, I want to thank you all for your time. To the audience at home or wherever you are watching this, thanks for joining us. But that's going to do us for today. We're going to have more events in this series, so stay tuned and keep an eye out for those.